and welcome to the session. My name is Kendra Little, and I am a DevOps advocate at Redgate. What that means is that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to make database development an integral part of the software development lifecycle and how to help people deploy database changes at a regular pace and to do so safely. I'm joined today for this session by William Durkin. I'm really excited to have our partner, William Durkin, here with us today. And William, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm William Durkin, and as Kendra said, I'm a partner with Redgate. I'm here from my own company called Data Masterminds, and we're a data platform specialization company based in Europe. And we help companies make sure they're making the right decisions all around the Microsoft data platform space. And part of that is obviously making sure that their DevOps works in the database as well.
Yeah, so it's fantastic to have you with me today, William, because you know how things actually work.
It's great to be here. It's always enjoyable to spend some time with you, Kendra.
Fantastic. Today we're talking about why the database is so important with DevOps. And here's an overview of what we're going to cover in this talk. We're going to talk about 4 key challenges that we see as part of why software development is more critical than ever and is more difficult than ever. And then we're going to look at some real world examples of using and optimizing the database as part of the software development process. Some examples of people succeeding at database DevOps, and then we'll bring it all together in the end. So first up, we're going to dig into these 4 key challenges. Based on our research at Redgate and the research of other companies, there's some trends out there that these are not going to, seem completely unsurprising to you, but their impacts can be really important when it comes to the database. The way that people are working together is changing. And the fact that it's more and more common to not see your coworkers face to face. Maybe you interact with your coworkers often on chat, Slack or Teams meetings. Maybe you interact with your colleagues more on email because some of your colleagues may technically work for different companies, or they may work in a different location, or they may even work in a different country. This is just increasingly common to have teams distributed and for there to be more complex relationships with our coworkers. And this, when it comes to database development, and deployment, can really compound an existing problem that we've had for years, where the people who manage and really understand how the database works, they exist in their own silo, and they work fairly separately from software development teams and from business users. As people spread apart and see each other less often, it becomes harder than ever for relationships to be built from the people who really understand, what is the nature of the data that we use, and also where are the parts of the production system that are most sensitive for performance or security. And then the people who are developing software, the people who are designing features for our customers. Another issue is that skill shortages are a problem. Hayes is a company who did a 2019 survey, and they survey IT managers, and they asked IT managers if they were facing a skill shortage. 70%. So 70% of IT managers reported to them that they face a moderate to extreme skill shortage. I think this is happening everywhere, and it's not that employees aren't intelligent. It's not that we aren't doing work. The problem is the amount of things we can learn, the amount of information we need to learn is increasing at a really fast rate. I mean, with available cloud technologies, we now have so many things we could learn. Plus, we have an increasing amount of legacy technology, right? As more software gets built and gets older, we have to learn to manage that as well. So it's hard for people to keep up. People are a bit overwhelmed. And then also, we're more distributed. So if you think about that problem with silos, that's harder than ever to confront and overcome between database folks and development folks. This shows up when we ask people about what stops them from implementing database DevOps. The number one answer, and this is not from just from people who have implemented it. This is from a wide group of people, many of whom hasn't implemented it. When we survey them and ask, what do you see as the main obstacle? People are very worried about skill shortages. William, have you found this to be the case among DevOps adopters where they're really worried about skill shortages? Does this survey data actually match what you see when you're working with folks on this?
Definitely, yes. There's, as is usual in IT, there is always the latest set of buzzwords that are being used to define new technologies and new processes. DevOps is clearly one of the front runners at the moment. And yeah, the idea of requiring a whole new set of skills is something that many people, maybe in older companies, which are maybe not on the edge of innovation, seem to see as some unsurmountable mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And they focus very much on the peak of the mountain instead of the first steps to get there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in general, it's trying to make people understand that they don't need to start off with an 100% complete and perfect solution to be using DevOps. The DevOps in itself is rather a process than a certain technology stack that we need to implement.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I've spent time with most of our recent clients who are going along this journey is to make them realize that it's actually a process change that they need to be making inside their companies, and a
Mm-hmm.
mindset change into how they approach actually adopting a process of making sure that they can make changes in their systems without them being huge monolithic changes.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to learn all these skills at once.
No,
You really don't.
indeed.
And
So
I like what you're saying there about the cultural change, because what that really means is it's that change of breaking down those silos that's actually the hard bit, right? You don't, because you don't have to learn all those skills at once. To make these initial steps, one of the initial things you need to do is just establish some communication paths
exactly that. Yes. So
between the
um,
production, the ops people and the devs people.
indeed. So as you mentioned, it's basically impossible to know all of the pieces of these puzzles yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah, the dev and the ops side of this whole equation need to be brought together, and it's traditional siloing of these different responsibilities is something that needs to be broken down, or rather, at least bridge the gap between the
Mhm.
two.
Yes.
And in that way, in actual fact, most companies do have the skill set internally already available. It's
Hmm.
just that they're not talking to each other. So
Right.
the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. As soon as you give them some common language and common ground to speak on,
Hmm.
then they very quickly realize, in actual fact, working as a team, we do have the full skill set that's required. And
Hmm.
then the journey begins much more simply.
Yeah. We do see evidence that when people start working on this, that it helps them. So to explain the stats on the screen, we ask teams in our state of database DevOps survey, we ask them, how well do your database specialists, your DBAs, work well with development? And there's different categories people can answer. So it goes everywhere from poor, or non-existent, maybe the lowest, to poor, to pretty well. And then the highest answer is great collaboration, which is defined as, so great collaboration is not easy. Great collaboration means the database specialist and the developers work effectively as a single team, right? So in other words, it's not just, good means, hey, we've got a good working relationship. Good is really good, but great is like, hey, yeah, we are one team, we are a single unit. And when we ask the survey takers, how is this going? Among all responders, only 22% say that database specialists and developers work as a single team. But among the people who have adopted DevOps, that goes almost double, way up, where people are saying because, and these are not necessarily people, this is not saying they are done with DevOps, right? It's not like they've, as William said, this is a process, right? This is them saying we have taken this on and we are working at continuously improving. And they do say we are working as a single team. Now, what isn't apparent in this metric is do you have any tips or insights, William, on what would make some teams more successful at having this working at a single team than others? Is there anything that a team member or a manager can do to try to say we're going to get to this point where we act as a single team?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, the big focus has to be in communication on the human side of this entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the immediate thought process of a DBA and a dev is to think of what technology can we use to make this all work so superbly.
I'm
And
so guilty of that.
yeah, oh, same. I am completely the same. I am a complete geek. But the realization that any choice of tool, there's tools till to the end of time that will help make something like a DevOps process be implemented.
Mm-hmm.
But ensuring that everybody understands what the actual aim of the process is, and keeping that clear and open communication between each of the team members is the key to this. There's also seems to be a little bit of trepidation in terms of, well, this is automation, it's going to remove responsibilities from me or previous permissions that I've had on certain systems.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as people understand this is actually freeing them up to actually do the real work instead of looking into the deep ops side of things or the deep dev side of things, that's the key that I like to try and focus on when clients or customers, companies are looking at how to improve their processes around this sort of area. It's the
That's
human factor, definitely.
that is a really good tip. I was chatting with Tony Madonna, who works at BMW earlier this week, and he manages a team of engineers. They cross different specialties, so they do database and other things. And he said that one of the things he does is very similar to what you just said, is that when he is explaining the benefits of DevOps to people, he does not talk about, he very specifically talks about automation as something that is not a replacement for people, because he says that never works. if you try to sell automation as a way to have less people hours, you will run into problems, because you still need those people to make sure that the automation is designed appropriately and is adapting as your business evolves. If you simply put automation in place and replace the people, you will be in a world of hurt.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, you need to also understand the entire process and how it all is glued together.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the people who are now freed up from having the automation in their process are able to spend their intellectual capacity on things that move the business forwards,
Right.
in actually creating and designing solutions that this DevOps process can deliver.
Right. So they're proactively aligning everything with the business, and that includes managing the automation and making sure everything's working well. And just, some people might be like, oh, that's not really how this works. If you're doubting this, think about one thing. Automation, and this is especially critical with databases, automation is fantastic. But automation, even with the most testing we can do, automation doesn't prevent accidents from happening. It makes actions more predictable in terms of how deployments are carried out. It may reduce the surface area for accidents, but we can put anything through automation. And as we're writing new codes, we have to also make sure we have the right test coverage, right? We have to do, as humans, all of these things to make sure that the automation is still working well, right? So yes, automated testing is very valuable, but it certainly doesn't protect you from making a mistake and then having your automation deploy that mistake everywhere.
Yeah,
So
completely. It
yeah,
does give you, though, it does free up your mind
yes,
to have extra cycles to spend on making your solution the correct one, to
right,
design it correctly, because you don't have to worry about how to deploy it.
yeah, yeah, exactly. One thing sometimes I find that people just get blocked on, they start out with a lot of energy. And they're saying, we're going to get going and we're going to take the first step with database DevOps. And often, not always, but very often, the first step is simply getting database code into source control. Often with these groups, we have, teams who are now more distributed than ever, and teams who, people are struggling to keep up. One of the very basic foundations that can help bring people together is having a source of truth established and having our database code in source control. Sometimes, though, when people get to this point, it's just not always obvious how to proceed, right? There's different ways that you can manage database code and source control. Like, you're confronted with a choice. Do you want to, use this method of storing the code or this other method? You have to decide on tooling, and this can just be very daunting to people. Like, oh, we're taking this first step, but wow, this is more complicated than I thought it would be. What do you see in terms of with people getting started with source control? How much should people worry about these choices? Do you encourage people to just kind of make a choice and keep going, or do you have specific recommendations you make? How do you think about this?
Well, as with anything, you're going to be making mistakes in the beginning either way. So the best thing to do is, in my opinion, and the way I try and approach it with clients who talk to us, is to say, okay, let's just take what you have in your current database, and we're just going to take that and bring it into source control.
Hmm.
Um, as you already mentioned, having some single source of truth is extremely important. In general, whether you're going to do DevOps or not, just being able to point to some pile of code somewhere in a repository and say, this is our database, is unbelievably important.
Hmm.
It still surprises me that some people are completely against the idea of having their code in source control. I was at a conference this week in Orlando, and somebody came up to me asking, how can I convince my developers that they need to put the database in source control? And
that
it's
that is
scary.
unfortunately not completely uncommon.
No,
Still,
indeed.
yeah.
And just being, for me at least, to be able to sleep at night and know if things get broken, or if I'm going to make a change to a huge complicated stored procedure, how can I roll that out backwards if I've made a mistake?
Right.
And that's the only way to do it, right? Unless you want to have copies of my stored procedure and my stored procedure _1 and _2 and _3 temp. And I've seen that in production as well. So
Yes.
that's the other option.
Well, and sometimes people they're like, we're going to start doing this better. And then they just put it in a file share, and then accidents happen because they haven't gone the whole way.
Yep.
I, I had a similar question from someone at the past summit conference recently in Seattle, who they were saying, I am really convinced that we need to get started along this way, but I'm meeting with resistance. And in their case, we chatted a little bit, and my advice was, well, how about if you propose, just to get started, right? Just this, because this is about constant communication and always improving, I would recommend suggesting, okay, I don't want to slow you down. I don't want to interrupt your process. How about if in this case, we start out with just each night taking a snapshot of the database code in production or at whatever window is the best, and we put that into source control. No, this is not ideal. We are not capturing even who did the change, right? But at least we are capturing the schema and we have it in source control so that we at least can now go back and say, when did something change? Right. And then once we get into the habit of having this regularly put into source control, then we can start making steps to say, okay, now we are going to try making changes in source control first and then moving it into other
For
environments. But
sure. Yeah, completely agree.
yeah,
That's a fantastic first step, at least.
yeah, making a first step is way better than not making a first step. And this is related to the second trend. So the second big trend that we're seeing is that it is no longer viable for companies to say, we are going to make plans about our products and services for the entire year, and then we are going to just carry out those plans for the year. Because what's happening is that customers expect more, and competition is more fierce than ever across a variety of industries. Salesforce did a survey in 2018. They do this state of the connected customer survey is what it's called. They do this each year, and they interview both buyers as well as retail end user retail customers. And they found that 63% of customers expect that companies provide new products and services more frequently than ever before. In other words, the majority of customers, 63%, say it is no longer just like, are you giving me what I paid for? It is no longer enough for me to just buy something I want and to keep getting what I wanted. Now I expect to be like, oh, you're doing something new. That's great. You've improved this. And if that doesn't happen, I start looking for someone else who does have a new twist on their product or service. Additionally, 80% of customers in this survey said that the experience a company provides is just as important as the products or services. So we need to have, while we are expecting, hey, you are delighting me with either a new feature or a new option or a better experience, I expect that things are consistently online all the time and that I can access things 24/7. And this correlates with economic research as well. James Besson did a study as part of his graduate research. And what he was looking at was whether in the current environmental or in current economic environment, whether companies could gain more market share by acquiring other companies or by investing in software. So this is very much targeted at company, research about if you want your company to get ahead, what should you spend your time on? Should you spend your time on acquisitions or should you spend your time on software? And what he found was that it's not all software in a company. It's really the software that is core to the value you're providing to your customers, right? So you don't have to write your own HR software unless you're in the industry of providing HR software, right? You can still buy vendor software. That often makes more sense. But for your specific products and services, writing valuable software, it not only lets small companies operate with an equal advantage to large companies. In fact, this is what makes startups be able to take market share away from larger companies. And part of this is, if you just kind of think about what we were talking about, if you work at a small new company, you don't have necessarily all of that legacy code and legacy database stuff to take care of. You can move more quickly. And this is a major threat to those more established companies. I think this is why, as William was saying, we are seeing even large companies say we have to be able to make changes more quickly. We have to be able to break down these silos, even though we are supporting legacy code, even though we are trying to learn new code, we have to be able to compete with these smaller companies. In our research at Redgate, we are seeing that the rate at which teams deploy database changes is increasing. So in terms of what this means for DevOps, this slide has a variety of techniques that people use to be able to deliver changes more, or to deliver changes to their products and services, to deliver value to their customers more quickly when it comes to database changes. William, do you have any thoughts on this? Are there things missing on the list, or are there things on this list which you have found to really help people when it comes to databases? What do you recommend when people are saying, hey, we need to be able to react more quickly and get started? What should we focus on?
So the ability to deploy frequently is a huge advantage. The idea there being you're making lots of very small changes,
Hmm.
because any change we're making to an application, and especially a database, has high risk involved. Database changes usually mean schema changes and with a potential of data loss if things go
Hmm.
wrong.
Yeah.
So deploying frequently doesn't just mean we're rushing out releases constantly. What it means is we're taking very small steps to ensure that each change we're making can be encapsulated and safely deployed without having to worry if this change is going to break everything. There's this previous plan of software releases where it's quarterly or sometimes only once a year.
Hmm.
Those monolithic changes are so dangerous for a company that it's so much better to push completely the opposite direction to very frequent deployments.
Right.
And it doesn't mean going from one yearly release to 20 daily releases, but certainly means increasing that release velocity just to make sure that you're by just yeah, basically like the saying goes, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time,
Yeah.
right? So taking small bites out of your entire problem will allow you to safely and confidently release changes into a system.
Right. And
And
this, oh, go ahead.
so the other points mentioned here, feature flags and backwards compatible code, those are all like the requirements that you will have in order to be able to make small incremental changes. Maybe you have a new feature coming that is going to be ready in 2 months, but if you can make the small steps towards that feature change already, then using feature flags and backwards compatible code allows you to do this.
Yes. Yeah. And what you said earlier about don't fixate on the pinnacle definitely applies here. There is a really interesting point in the data from the most recent Accelerate State of DevOps survey. So this research is published every year by, it's now published by Google. It's Dr. Nicole Forsgren and her colleagues, Gene Kim, Jez Hungbul, I think Jesse Frizzell joined them in the research this year. And this research isn't specific to databases. They do look at some things with databases, but they look at DevOps very broadly. So one of the most interesting findings, I think, from the 2019 survey that they put out is they categorize people into different groups based on performance. So you can have, you might be a low performer, a medium performer, a high performer, or an elite performer. And this year, they broke down different practices by performance group. And what I thought was quite interesting was in the elite performers, so these are the people who are doing the very best. They are deploying very frequently. And when something goes wrong, they can fix it very, very fast without impact to customers. And things don't go wrong as often. For these folks, not all of them have fully automated their production deployments in the elite group, but they are still doing really, really well. And that's just to say that in order to do well at DevOps, like we tend to think, oh, it's kind of a prerequisite to have automated everything to do well. No, that's not the case. You can do this with small steps at a time. Start automating deployments in development. Start automating environment setup in early production. Fully automating, especially for databases, fully automating production deployment may be a very large cultural and political change in your company, right? If that is going to be a difficult thing to get through, do not focus on doing that first. You can gain huge amounts of success by working on validating code and automation in all of your processes prior to production, for example. So I thought that was actually quite inspiring of like, look, even people who are doing really well, it's not like they're at what we assume. We always assume other people find this easy. No, it's not easy. The other thing on here that I think is you alluded to that's really important is that every time you make a deployment, your customer shouldn't see a change. Deployment should be boring,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Um,
for sure.
Yeah, if you're starting to move towards more frequent deployments, that doesn't mean that every time you make a change, something is revealed to the customer. Anytime you can use something like a feature flag to say, essentially our deployment staged this feature to be ready, but we can turn this off with a something in the application. We can turn it on and off. That frees you up and gives you a lot more flexibility, and it makes your life a lot easier.
Exactly, especially as in general application deployments, you can usually swap out an application or a website, whereas a database, quite a few deployments will be larger schema changes which require some sort of system outage or maintenance window. So pre-packaging those months in advance allow you to then make a very fast application switch when newest feature ABC is ready.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we're deploying frequently, but we aren't necessarily changing what customers see on every deployment. And that took a long time for my brain to get around that when it comes to databases. For the third trend, so the two trends we've covered already are that we have more distributed teams that's compounding the problem of silos as well as skill shortages. Also, we have to respond to our customers faster. That was number two. The third trend is that now not only do we have to manage estates, especially when we're at more established companies, not only do we have to manage estates where we're moving into things like DevOps and we're moving into using newer software development processes, and we've got these legacy systems, but also we now have to manage estates that have some things in the cloud and some things on-prem. And the tooling for this, we want to unify as much as possible. So, and I'm curious how much cloud adoption you're seeing, William, in your area. Are you seeing a lot of this? Are you seeing a little bit? How
Um,
much do your customers work with this?
it's partially almost country-based differences, and then clearly also the market vertical as well. So
Mm-hmm.
we have a lot of companies in mainland Europe, quite a few in the Netherlands, who are really open to the latest innovative technologies and have been very open to the idea of using the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
Some companies come, like recently we helped them, one of our clients ditch their entire on-prem estate. So this was like 30 web servers and 50 database servers,
Mm-hmm.
completely swapped out, and they're all in the cloud now. Whereas
Wow.
some of our clients, especially in Germany, so rather technology conservative type country, who have been very much not against, but very cautious about cloud adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And that is slowly swinging the way that this survey is indicating. So going from a less adoption towards more adoption, but it's a long, slow process to make sure people understand exactly what the cloud means. And we seem to be, in Germany at least, between 5 and 10 years behind the curve.
Mm. Do you
But it's getting there.
do you think that recent announcements like things like Azure Arc are going to change this?
Yes, simplifying the entire space around cloud and on-prem and merging the two to become more of a hybrid solution is taking away the sharp edges from the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
making it that we don't have to necessarily care anymore, and
Mm-hmm.
making a migration into the cloud just simpler, just takes away those difficulties and allows people to accept these solutions as much more viable for sure.
Mm-hmm. For folks who haven't kept up on Azure Arc, actually, do you like to explain Azure Arc, William, or should I have a go at it? I can't promise I'll be great, but I have a
I
version.
I can't promise either, so I'll let you handle that one and then jump in if I think you've made a mistake or two.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think about this in a very database centric way because that's really a lot of where my interest lies. But what Microsoft has announced recently at their conferences is that they are going to support now using a lot of the tooling that they use in the cloud at the Microsoft Cloud, allowing people to expand this tooling and using it in other ways. So this will enable scenarios like, I want to be in multiple clouds and have a single way of managing that. But also potentially, I want to use the same cloud management tools in my own data center, either in a hybrid estate or perhaps just on my own. So if you wanted to use, say, Azure SQL database, but not just have it in the Microsoft cloud, that scenarios like that will become possible. So you can have your cloud using very well tested, established enterprise management frameworks. You can have that same technology in more places, perhaps even in your own data center,
Exactly.
which
And
kind
I
of,
guess,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, I guess that is also what will bring the ability for companies who are maybe constrained by legal reasons
Mhm,
to remain on premises, that they will still be able to attract the skills of or the high skilled people who know the cloud almost natively.
mhm.
That this whole single view of an entire system, whether in the cloud or on premises, is what will allow exactly that.
Yeah. So if you've been holding off on learning about cloud technologies because just in your industry or in your company, you don't see it going there, this is an indication that it may be time to start learning. Because it may be coming in a way that is allowed now by your country or your company or your industry, whereas before it was riskier. In terms of working in these increasingly complex environments, right, where we manage things like we manage database as a service, whether it's Azure SQL database or SQL Server RDS in Amazon or Google's cloud database, whatever it is, we manage those quite differently than we do kind of classic boxed product Oracle or SQL Server or even Postgres. It's interesting in terms of how do we help our teams deal with this? Version control, which we've already talked about, having a single source of truth in version control, that centralizing that code is extraordinarily helpful. Especially, as I'm migrating a database, if I don't have version control for that database, and now I've got the old version of the database and the new version of the database, and then a dev database, and they all have different schema, like which one's right? Version control solves that. So that's a big unifier. William, what are your thoughts on, like, because I've got a bunch of stuff on this slide. What do you really emphasize to people who are making these changes in terms of maintaining their sanity and helping communication across the teams?
Sure. It's going to be an increasing challenge to be able to deal with the multiplicity of estates and systems that are going to be working together. So I spend a lot of my time trying to get my head around the automation side of things. The systems are getting more and more complex. DevOps does not make systems simpler. There is certainly a complexity to it that needs managing. And as
Mhm,
such, automation of the management side becomes even more important as well. And this won't change, even if Azure Arc, as we mentioned before, becomes a fully fledged product and can deal with multiple on-premises or cloud solutions. Being able to understand how they all fit together and being able to manage them is going to be the next challenge, I think,
mhm,
from an ops side of the equation at least. And generally, I think more and more the development side for databases and application are stepping further and further away from where and how systems are hosted, whether that be web
mhm,
services or database services. They just need effectively an API endpoint to talk to, whether that's
mhm,
storage or web services, as I mentioned. And I actually think that's a good thing. We should not be we shouldn't really care, is this on SQL Server 2017, SQL Server
mhm.
2019, Azure SQL DB, or Oracle, or whatever. They should not really matter for a business where these things run, just that
Right.
the data is available and the applications run as I expect them to.
Right. And yeah, I need these capabilities is more what it's about
Yeah,
rather than
exactly.
I need this specific thing.
Yes.
I like that. And I think that mindset helps free up database folks to it takes a little bit of the pressure off in terms of, oh, I need to be an expert on this thing. It's more about I need to learn what the capabilities are of different things, and I need to be get used to constantly learning about the changing capabilities of things.
Yeah.
Because in the modern world with this expanding landscape, we are never going to be done learning about things because the capabilities are constantly changing.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. And also this idea of implementing DevOps, it's not you will never hit a finished period. It will you are constantly changing this process and making it fit
right.
exactly your business needs.
Yeah. And that's good news for job security.
For
So,
sure, yeah, that's true.
I mean, one of the things on this slide that I really like, because this was something I missed for a long time, I had a kind of a blind spot here, is I thought monitoring was just for IT people. It wasn't for developers. And there was a little bit probably of fear in here of like, oh, if they could do this, who needs me anymore? You have plenty to learn and plenty to worry about if you're on the operation side. There's things like just keeping up with what are the different capabilities, what are the right platforms and things.
Yeah,
You don't have to give over all responsibility for monitoring, but it is helpful whenever you can, whenever it's possible for you to give a window into the development team where they can see, hey, we deployed this change. Did CPU go up to 100% afterwards? That is very useful to connect them to that information, and it empowers them to be able to react more quickly to it.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it can really help people work more as a single team.
it certainly brings the developers and the operations team together. Um, Previously, then the developers just threw their changes over the wall and said, "Ops, deploy this for me." Now they can see if the monitoring is set up in the right way, they're able to see exactly what their changes are doing to the system.
Right.
And then they become more invested in making sure the system it remains healthy.
Yeah. Which, yeah, it's not going to take your job away. The fourth trend, now this is the no fun trend. I mean, it's necessary, but no one hears the word regulatory pressures. Well, most people don't hear the words regulatory pressures and get excited, but this is very, very necessary that we don't we respond to all of these things and that we try to speed up our ability to deliver value to customers without putting our customer data at risk. And this is particularly of concern to database DevOps because the development environments that we use, we can't just have no data in them. How do you test that your application is actually working if there's no data for it to work on? And if the data is nothing like the data in your production environment, you will get either you won't be able to test successfully, hey, is this even functioning? Your users won't be able to do acceptance testing on it, and you won't really know what anything's going to be like. So there's this problem where we often have copies of production data that are not masked floating around in our environments. And this becomes very vulnerable to things like phishing attacks, where people get your network credentials and then they can go harvest data from your development environments. Do you see this happening places where there's unmasked data, William, or are people in your region a little better about this than we are in my region?
No, I I would be surprised if 36% of data is actually masked. I think it would be much lower than that.
Ah,
It's a requirement that everybody does make sure that their data, their production data, and personally identifiable information is masked. I very rarely see that completely implemented throughout an entire environment,
yeah.
unfortunately. But as you mentioned, legislation requires it to happen, and
Hmm.
it's something that must be done. The good thing being, if you set up a clean DevOps process, then you can make sure that this exact thing can be implemented completely automagically so that you don't have to think about it anymore.
Right. Yeah. And this is one of the areas where expanding technology can really help because there are ways to do this that don't require as much manual, so you don't have to write all the scripts to do this yourself like you used to have to do. This is, I think, for data folks, one of those things to really raise awareness of in the business, because if folks who specialize in data don't sort of raise their hand and say, we've been doing this thing for a long time, right? We're doing this the way we always have, but this is risky for our business because of these reasons. We should really look at this. If data folks don't do that, then who would do that? So it really, and then if you do have a data breach, I mean, there is good reason to do this, because if you're found to be in violation of these regulations, or if you have a data breach and it's found that you didn't take these measures, then it is often the data folks who are looked at as, well, why didn't you bring our attention to this? So this is one of those things to make sure the business is aware of, okay, how are we using this customer data, and are we at risk when it comes to regulation and data breaches? It is an area where bringing in automation can reduce the pain and the risk of this as well.
Yep, completely agree.
So a little bit about customers. After I talk about regulation, I'm always like, I want to talk about something where people have actually made progress. Like this, people can deal with this even in this world of regulation. So I've got a couple of examples here where this one is an example of a financial management business who's growing rapidly, and they have a real need for their staff, when they work with customers, to have very fresh, up-to-date insights. Otherwise, someone will go to a different wealth management business. And they had an issue where the database was causing a problem. So like the trends we saw, they have to adapt faster, they have to deliver value faster, but they have multiple development teams, very distributed. They'd implemented Agile methods, but they'd only implemented it for the application tier, so the web servers. And what they had established was this, what we call a two-speed working culture, where they could deploy changes very quickly unless they were a database change. Is this something you see commonly, where like people have made progress, but they've completely left out the database, William?
Yes. Database is always the bottleneck in these sorts of scenarios, and it's so common as to say the other way. Making a database deployment in an agile method is a rarity, even now.
Yeah.
It's something that we try, or we should try to get to, but this is the normal mode of operation at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah. This company tackled the issue, and they made great strides in eliminating that two-speed culture, and they tracked their metrics while they did it. So this, if you are embarking on this, these are some metrics that you may want to track at the beginning. Don't wait to start looking at these things, because you want to be able to tell the management of your business, okay, this is how much engineering time we used to spend on deployments, and here's where we are now. So in this case, for a deployment, it used to take 12 hours of people doing stuff. And now, I mean, they haven't made it completely automated, but they've eliminated 10 hours per deployment, right? That's an obvious big win. Looking at how many errors happen after deployment, they've reduced that by 30%. And also they have static code analysis implemented. And so they have, standards for coding practices. So huge amount of success that you can get there. And these are some of the metrics that can help you show that off. Another story, this is a very heavily regulated industry, is an international airline. They had a lot of pressure to improve their technology, and they'd been working already on modernizing their fleet of aircraft, right? So it's not like they hadn't been doing anything, but they had now turned to saying, we need to really, this is very competitive industry. The experience that people have using the website, using the apps, that has to be top notch as well to compete. But they were having problems with the database. When they made deployments, it didn't always go as planned and was even causing downtime. And they also looked at their processes and said, we have an issue where we are using data in development in ways, and just our lack of use of source control. If we have an audit, that is not okay in our industry, and that could be very, very damaging. So they implemented Compliant Database DevOps, and they also focused on adopting technology that would enable them to use on-demand secure data sets, as well as source control, so that they now know for sure if anyone audits us, not only do we have this source of truth, but we can show that the code flowing through to production, we always know who introduced this code, where it was introduced, and we are following all the regulations about protecting customer data in our entire software development process as well. So that was a huge leap for them. So success is absolutely possible. And we've talked about this a little bit. This is a different saying, though. I'm curious, do people use this saying where you are often, William? The if it hurts, do it more often?
I can't say that I've heard that one, to be honest. But it makes sense for sure.
Yeah. Well, it sounds kind of ridiculous at first, but it is kind of getting to what you were saying earlier about working in small chunks of work. So if it hurts, why would I do it more often? Well, the idea is that if it hurts and you're doing it more often, maybe don't do it in the exact same way you were always doing it. Maybe break it down into smaller tasks so that if something fails, you can find out about it earlier. And this is really, I mean, like with database changes, like you were saying, this is often where the pain is. So starting to move towards more frequent deployments and breaking down how much is in a deployment is really that incremental step. And I'm curious if you found this as well. That Accelerate report, what they have found, they've done this for, I feel like it's 8 years. And every year they have found that implementing DevOps doesn't just allow people to deploy more quickly, but it also improves the stability of the systems. Have you found this? Or I mean,
Definitely.
this is going to vary, right?
Yeah, but still, database deployments, as I mentioned before, they're the highest risk changes to be making.
Mm-hmm.
And keeping those down to really bite-sized chunks as changes just makes the entire process so much more stable.
Right. Well, it also, if something does go wrong, I worked with a system once where code would sometimes take 2 months to get to be deployed. And one of the problems with that was, even if we were deploying a small unit of it, when it finally got deployed, if something went wrong, the people who'd written the code didn't, they'd been working on something else for 2 months. They didn't remember.
Exactly.
So increasing that tempo, doing small units of work that can move more quickly to production also just means that if you have to react to something, people will know what they're reacting to.
Yeah. And you're concentrating your problem space. If you've only made 1 or 2 small changes and things have gone wrong, it's much easier to troubleshoot than the last 6 months of work that we've done, what has been broken.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And you can even identify what changed.
Yeah, that too.
It's something that some folks take for granted, but it is really, really useful. So what we have here on the screen now is if you want to chat with William and his team about getting help, we've got contact info there. We've also got some contact info for Redgate here. But we would love to hear questions and comments from folks who are attending the session live. While we're waiting for questions to come in, William, do you want to say a little bit about what you do at Data Masterminds?
Yeah, so basically we help anybody who's using the Microsoft Data Platform to make sure that they're using the technology in the right way and help identify what exactly a business is trying to achieve and make sure the solutions they choose in the Microsoft Data Platform are the right ones to get to that goal.
Fantastic. Yeah, and what we do at Redgate is really enable folks to make compliant database DevOps happen. So working with partners like Data Masterminds is really, really valuable in terms of helping make sure people have the tooling and the services and the advice that they need as well.
All right. So thank you very much, Kendra and William, for your interesting presentation. As Kendra already managed, we now have some time for Q&A left, as we have about, I would say 5 minutes till the full hour. So I think Kendra just had to leave, unfortunately, but William will be there to take over the Q&A session. So William, Do you have any questions already in your tab that you want to answer? I think there are already some, right?
Yep, that's right. We've got 3 questions so far. So I'll start with the first one. If there are any other questions you want to post, please do so in the chat, and Etan will take care of making sure we get to those. So the first question we got here is, you spoke about the reasons to source control the database. Are there any risks or common pitfalls with regard to this? So basically, the main risk that I see around this is if you by accident are storing any passwords in your source code. This is not a database specific problem, but general source code control problem. I think the rise of the use of GitHub, the online source control system, the people who run GitHub have managed to find over 1 billion passwords stored inside the publicly available source control on GitHub for certain projects. So that's one of the major risks that you would have by placing your databases into source control in that case. So if you're storing passwords. Otherwise, a general pitfall that you could run into is the fact of not everybody on the team using the source control at the same time. So as a database itself has a state inside it as well. So there's data inside the code as well. So if somebody's making changes and not using source control at the same time as the rest of the team, then they could potentially be changing data on the database server, even if it's the development machine, and making changes outside of source control, which then disappear. So it's quite common for that sort of an issue to turn up, where a developer is almost refusing to use source control and then causing absolute mayhem for everybody else. Okay, next question we have. Database changes will be deployed even more frequently. Do you have predictions how the deployment requirements will change in the next 2 to 3 years? Basically, as soon as you begin placing your databases into source control, then the ability to deploy using continuous integration and continuous deployment mean that you're going to basically change your deployment strategy to be a much more frequent one. So instead of waiting an entire month or a quarter or even a year that I've seen with some companies to make a big deployment, making small incremental changes as the weeks go by means that you're reducing your risk in general. So as companies are able to adopt this deployment strategy in their database development process as well, then I think in the next few years, this will become much more streamlined to the same sort of frequency and flexibility that we see with application deployment strategies or application development strategies, where we're doing 2-week sprints maybe and deploying changes in much more in a much shorter time frame. And these monolithic changes, I think, will start to die out, or I hope they will, because otherwise that's going to be even more difficult to continue, where application deployments are going so much quicker and the database doesn't keep up. And we have one final question so far, stating, curious to hear your thoughts on deploy frequently as it applies to infrastructure software. Where is the line drawn between where that makes sense and where it doesn't? Do you really want your database vendor to be making lots of small changes? So this is going to always be a slightly difficult thing to deal with. Now, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we're talking about taking third-party applications that we're hosting on premises and receiving frequent updates for those. For many third-party applications that are deployed in this way, they deploy their changes much more, should we say slowly? Yeah, slowly. They're much slower in their deployment strategy than, say, Windows updates, or maybe if you're doing your own in-house development. So I don't see this being such a risk or such an issue, because the changes that get pushed out are really rather rare. And in that case, As a DBA myself, the amount of times I've seen third-party software that just doesn't ever get a patch from the third-party company or from the third-party supplier, I don't really see there being a rise in or a chance that this is going to change very much in the future, even though they possibly could do. There are some companies which are starting to adopt this, and in that case, it's just a question of being more open to the communication between the third-party supplier and your own internal teams. And if they have developed a sensible deployment strategy using the right tooling, then it should also be completely painless on your side to be able to deploy infrastructure code that's getting such frequent deployments. So I think that's answered all of the open questions, unless you still have some more in the pipeline, Etan.
I think one just arrived. If you have a look in the panel,
Yep,
can you
okay.
see it? Yeah, perfect.
So it says here, what if you are one of these third-party vendors? Should you be trying to achieve CI/CD? CI/CD being continuous integration, continuous deployment. If you are one of these third-party suppliers, I think, yes, you should be aiming towards a more frequent and more continuous deployment strategy. Just from a maintenance standpoint, having multiple customers with multiple different versions installed is just a support nightmare. And if you can get your deployment process to be completely smooth and non-painful, then the pushback from the client side to actually install these patches, which also exists, there are lots of companies that just don't want to touch running systems. If you can arrange your deployment process to be so painless and so smooth that actually deploying a change isn't painful, but is rather a nice thing for a client to do, then that can only be helpful for you as a third-party vendor. So you, in my opinion, yes, certainly strive for making sure things are as comfortable and as easy to process as possible. And it seems I've made the right answer, or at least a clear enough answer for the person who asked that question. If there are no other questions, then you can see, I think still on the screen, how to get in touch with either Kendra or Redgate themselves as a company, or me and my company, Data Masterminds. If there are any questions that have popped up now, or if you think over the weekend, oh no, I wish I'd asked this question, then please do not hesitate to get in touch. We're completely open to any sorts of questions around this deployment idea and everything to do with it. And otherwise, thank you very much for your time. I think, Ayrton, are we now out of time?
Yeah, I would say more or less. We are over the hour, and I think as all the questions have been answered, we are ready to wrap it up, I would say.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you everybody for listening to Kendra and I talk about the deployment process in a database. I hope it's been useful to you, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, William, for the presentation and for taking part in the Q&A. Also, greetings to Kendra, of course. And yeah, have a nice weekend ahead. And thanks for being on the show, Will.
Yeah, sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.